بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I would like to thank the I3 Institute for organizing this important conference and for inviting me to give a presentation on the very important subject of deism. And I would like to thank all the listeners, whether you're listening live or will be listening to a recording of this session later, for showing interest in this topic, because it really is an important one that Muslims ought to be familiar with. And of course, I'd like to wish you all a belated Ramadan Mubarak, and I pray, inshallah, that you and your families and friends are safe. Just a note to the admin, am I able to share my screen? Because I have a presentation which I'd like to share.
Yes, inshallah.
The option should be there at the bottom of the screen.
Okay.
Do you see it?
Who can start sharing? It's asking me. Yeah, okay, here we go.
Perfect.
Can you guys see my presentation?
Yes.
We got it.
Great, perfect. Well, inshallah, before I start, inshallah, let's take a look at the agenda together. For it, it's my intention, inshallah, to take you through the following today. First, we'll start off by defining what deism is. And we'll take a very brief cursory look at the historical emergence and try to contextualize deism's emergence. We'll briefly talk about the relevance of deism today, and then we'll get to the exciting part and begin critiquing deism as a worldview. So we'll be looking at two arguments today. The first one is deism's incoherence, considering God's wisdom, and the second argument is the possibility and significance of divine revelation. And then inshallah, we'll conclude with some final remarks. Now, I just want to say that this presentation is originally 45 minutes in length. So since I have less time to present it to you today, what I've done is that I've reduced much of the content so that the presentation only includes the most relevant bits. And inshallah, at the end of the presentation, I'll guide you all to my detailed article on the topic so that you could seek more details on the subject, inshallah. So beginning with, what is deism? Well, deists, just like any other group of people, are not monolithic. They have disagreements over several theological notions, such as whether there's an afterlife or if there's even divine judgment in this afterlife, if it exists. They disagree on what the ultimate purpose of life is and whether there's even a path to salvation, whether there's a specific path to salvation, let alone if there's even a need for salvation. They dispute over the attributes of God. Is God a good God or is he an evil God? Deists, etc. So deists, have historically tended to disagree with each other on these critical questions. However, despite these differences, we can still try to formulate a workable definition to help us guide our discussion on deism. So deism, we can define deism as the belief that God created yet remains uninvolved in the world, and that man should only accept religious and moral knowledge obtainable through the strict use of reason. Now, deism can be defined, deism can be defined as the belief in a God who is disinterested in his creation. And for that reason, because he's disinterested, he chooses to not intervene in the affairs of his creation. And as a consequential result of this, deism would also predictably assert that God does not send divine revelation to his creation. And it also denies the existence of miracles, because it maintains that God does not intervene in the natural world order in any way. Moreover, deism stresses the importance of human reason. Any religious knowledge, any moral knowledge of halal and haram that you wish to obtain can only be obtained through the strict use of reason. So in a nutshell, deism is the belief in a God who created the universe and chose to never intervene or be involved in it. Deism teaches that we must rely on our reason alone to deduce what this God demands from us, if he demands anything at all. A brief history of deism. Now, in academia, deism specifically refers to that movement whose emergence we could trace back to the 17th century during the English Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a major intellectual movement that emphasized the importance of several ideas, like the importance of reason, freedom of religion, secularism, the elevation of the status of science, tolerance, justice, etc. And deism conveniently aligned with these stances propagated by the Enlightenment thinkers, because deists themselves were emphasizing the importance of reason, and they were also very strongly opposed to the theological creeds of Christianity, which they deemed to be absurd. And of course, they were also very vocal critics of the Catholic Church's very oppressive policies and the corruption which ran rampant in the church at the time. Some scholars refer to deism as the religion of the Enlightenment. And so the Enlightenment served as a critical backdrop for the flourishing and spread of deism. And deism, unfortunately, lives on until today and has been adopted by people who may not even explicitly identify themselves as deists, though they are in reality. Now, as we take a look at this slide, we see a number. Let me guide your attention to the left side. So here, this is a Pew research study conducted in 2017, and basically they were asking ex-Muslims in the United States why they chose to leave Islam, and the reason that was most highlighted and noted was the following: because they don't like organized religion, they stopped believing in religion. So it's not that they left Islam because they started to disbelieve in the existence of God, or that they had a specific problem with Islam itself and converted to another religion. Rather, their primary issue was that they became disenchanted with the whole notion of organized religion altogether. That's deism right there. And that's the number one reason and that was provided. And unfortunately, deism's negative impact on the Ummah is not restricted to the West. Unfortunately, deism has gained a foothold in certain pockets of the Muslim world, and especially in the last 5 to 10 years. Over here, you could see a Facebook page for an Arab deist group with thousands of members in it. It's called Ittihad al-Rububiyyin al-Arab. Deism in Arabic is referred to as Rububiyyah. And Arab deists, unfortunately, have a very active presence in the Arabic digital sphere. When we look at Turkey, unfortunately, deism has been surging in Turkey as of late, to the extent that even President Erdogan acknowledged deism's threat to Islam, and the Turkish Minister of Religious Affairs even noted how serious of a threat deism is to the faith of Muslims, particularly in Turkey. So the point of this slide is to highlight and to bring to everyone's attention that deism is an intellectual threat that which Muslims need to be wary of. We need to take note of it, and you know, because a lot of us have our minds so focused on refuting Christianity and refuting atheism that, you know, deism is just quietly creeping in under under our radars, and so it's something that we need to pay serious attention to. Now we step into critiquing deism, and we'll be looking at the first argument. Now, what I'm going to do here is that I'm first going to present to you the argument. I'm going to present the argument, and then I'm going to explain it. So don't worry if you don't fully grasp it as I'm reading it out. So I'll make sure, inshallah, to explain it in detail, but I just want to lay it out first. So this is the first argument that we'll be utilizing against deism. Premise 1. Wisdom necessitates acting in a meaningfully objective-driven manner. Let me repeat that because it was quite a mouthful. Premise 1, wisdom necessitates acting in a meaningfully objective-driven manner. Premise 2, God is either perfectly or exceedingly wise. Premise 3, deism does not affirm God's intervention in the world. Premise 4, God's wisdom is incompatible with his non-intervention in the world. Conclusion, deism is incoherent. Now, this argument takes the form of a syllogism, meaning we first present some premises, which are these, 4 of them, or propositions or assumptions which set out to make certain claims. And then based on these claims, we attempt to derive a conclusion, which is this at the end. And in order for this entire syllogistic argument to work effectively, 2 things must be fulfilled. First, we must demonstrate the truthfulness of the premises themselves. We have to demonstrate that these claims are true. And secondly, that the conclusion logically follows from these premises. So the question here is that the case here? I contend that it is. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to understand and argue for the veracity of each of these premises. So let's look at the first premise. Premise 1, wisdom necessitates acting in a meaningfully objectives-driven manner. Basically, all this is saying is that if one were to act wisely, then one ought to act in a meaningful manner, which would involve achieving certain objectives. An act done with no purpose or meaning is an unwise act. And quite frankly, this premise is fairly straightforward, and it really wouldn't be disputed by deists because it is pretty straightforward. Over here, I quote a couple of classical ulama defining what hikmah or divine wisdom is. However, due to time constraints, I'm not going to read them out. So all I'm just going to say is this: in summary, God's wisdom can be defined as that aspect of his knowledge that wills the actualization of anything which furthers the objectives and goals God set out in his intended act. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not act in a meaningless manner. There's always a goal or an objective underlying Allah's actions. Second premise, God is either perfectly or exceedingly wise. Now, again, the overwhelming majority of deists would once again agree with this premise. In fact, I don't think that any deist would dispute this premise. I mean, deists historically, believe that God is the great architect. We have to ask ourselves, why do deists even believe in God's existence to begin with? Well, because they recognize that the universe requires a designer. They believe in the strengths of the argument from design, also known as the teleological argument. and the earliest deists actually used to refute the atheists for disbelieving in the existence of God. And so they believe that God designed the universe. Secondly, and as a lead up to that, we have to understand that God's astounding creation reflects the magnitude of his attributes. Now, for God to have meticulously designed the universe as we see it today, and something which deists admit, implies that God is at the very least, exceedingly, even if they don't want to admit infinitely, because some deists would say there's no proof for saying that God's attributes are infinite. That's irrelevant for the purpose of this argument. We as Muslims believe that God is perfectly wise, but just for the sake of argument, even if we could just grant it for the sake of argument, we'll say, okay, fine, God is exceedingly wise. All right. But just by looking at the design of the universe, we could deduce that God's at least exceedingly powerful and knowledgeable. We know God is powerful, for God cannot have created the universe without the tremendous ability which it demands, which is power. And we also know that God is knowledgeable. For such an intricately designed universe, requires its designer to be knowledgeable enough to know where everything fits. And so, all in all, the magnificence of the design of the universe reflects the properties of its designer. Thus, the absolute greatness of God's wisdom could easily be deduced simply by looking at the universe. And once again, deists would not dispute this. So you don't need to work so hard to validate this premise. Premise number 3, deism does not affirm God's intervention in the world. Now, yes, as we just discussed, the central position of deists is that God remains inoperative in and unconcerned with the world he created. So again, this premise is not under dispute. Premise 4, now this is the crux of the argument. Premise 4, God's wisdom is incompatible with his non-intervention in the world. Now, as I said, deists would affirm God's wisdom because they affirm that he designed the universe, and that which would entail that he's exceedingly wise because it requires knowledge, etc. And they also assert and believe that God does not intervene in the world. So right now, what we're arguing is that there is a problem with these two beliefs. There is serious tension between the two. So this is the premise which deists are likely to dispute, and is the one which you're going to have to exert some effort in defending. Now, the claim the premise is making is this: God's non-intervention in the world, in the affairs of his creation, and his unconcern with the creation is a compromise, is a serious compromise of his wisdom. Why? Well, first of all, as noted before, purposeless and meaningless acts are unwise acts. Now, doing something for no reason at all is by definition unwise. Now, the question comes, if this designer is infinitely or extremely or exceedingly wise, then how can someone who is so exceedingly wise enough to create and design this magnificent universe be so unwise enough to create the universe with no purpose in mind? You see, a wise person does things for a reason. If us finite human beings do not build and create things for simply no reason whatsoever, what then do we think about this great cosmic and infinitely or exceedingly wise designer of the universe? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, did you think that we created you uselessly and that to us you would not be returned? Does man think that he will be left neglected? So here the Quran is nudging us to really reflect upon the viability of this deistic stance. So in summary, there is serious tension between the belief that God created the universe for no reason whatsoever, but to run on its own natural course like clockwork without a care for whatever happens to it, and the deistic affirmation that God is an exceedingly wise being who impressively designed the universe. So just as a quick recap, let's look at the argument again. This is the argument. We said that premise one is wisdom necessitates acting in a meaningfully objectives-driven manner. Yes, for an act to be wise, the act would have to have an underlying objective or goal to it. An act which is completely meaningless and purposeless is not a wise act. Premise two, God is either perfectly or exceedingly wise. And we said that this could be deducible just by looking at the universe, which would reflect the properties of its designer. And this is not, you will not expect this to be seriously disputed by deists. Premise three, deism does not affirm God's intervention in the world. This is basically what deists believe. And premise four, what we just spent time arguing right now, God's wisdom is incompatible with his non-intervention in the world, because to simply create the universe and have no care for it, not be involved in it, and to just create it for absolutely no reason and to discard it is a purposeless and unwise act, unbefitting for such an exceedingly wise designer of the universe. And with that, the conclusion comes by default that deism is incoherent. Moving on to the second argument. Here, as we said before, deists reject the idea of divine revelation. They believe there's no need for it. Now, this second argument has to do with demonstrating the likelihood, demonstrating the likelihood and probability of revelation itself. So if we can show that there are very good reasons for thinking why God would send down revelation, this would severely weaken the deistic case. And this argument would, I just want to say this as a note, that this argument would mostly work against deists who affirm that God is both wise and good. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that there are some deists who believe that God is evil. These arguments wouldn't work as well against them. You're going to have to use another argument to refute them. I deal with that in my paper. I won't be covering that here today, unfortunately. However, many, if not most deists do affirm that God is good. And so if the deist affirms that God is both good and wise, these arguments that I'm going to show you right now have a good chance of working against him. So the question here is, are there good reasons for thinking that God would send revelation to humanity? And I'd say absolutely. And alhamdulillah, as I was sifting through the books of the classical ulama, I was able to compile a good number of arguments on this front. Just for the sake of time, I'm just going to mention four. The first one is divine revelation clarifies the moral commands of God. So this is the first good reason for believing why God would send revelation, if he does exist and if he is wise and good. That divine revelation clarifies the moral commands of God. Now, many deists would say that God expects us to be good. Many deists would say that God expects us to be good. However, God expects us to know what is good strictly through the use of our reason. Now, yes, it's possible based on reason alone to perhaps agree on some broad moral universals or principles, like it's good to be just, sexual ethics are important, murdering innocent people is wrong, etc. However, when it comes to the particular and specific understanding and application of these broad moral principles, people strongly differ with each other. And so this is where the utility of divine revelation comes in handy, whereby it helps clarify what specific understanding of these moral universals or these broad moral principles like justice and sexual ethics, etc., we should be having. The second reason why we could expect that God would send revelation is that it can disclose matters that are inaccessible by our unaided reason. So based on our reason alone, we can't know for certain if God expects us to worship him or not, let alone if there's even a specific way he wants us to worship him. Based on reason alone, we can't know for certain if there is an afterlife or divine judgment or a path to salvation which we're supposed to follow. However, revelation could usefully aid us in coming to know these things. Thirdly, divine revelation clarifies the nature of our relationship with God. What is the nature of our relationship with God? Is it one of friendship? Just like how Ibrahim alayhi salam was the Khalilullah, the friend of Allah. Is it one of alliance? Are we awliyaullah? Or is it one of servitude? Are we ibadullah? Or is it a combination of them all? Or is it something like how Christianity says that there's some sort of spiritual, childlike relationship with God, and that we are his spiritual children and that we are the sons of God? Well, revelation could really assist us in knowing this. Fourthly, divine revelation justifies the moral accountability of sinners. Now, if there is an afterlife and divine judgment, well, then many sinners and non-believers could argue back against God on the day of judgment by saying that he never warned them because he never sent them a revelation clarifying what his demands were, that they had no idea that he even wanted them to abide by a certain moral code or to adopt specific theological beliefs. However, with the revelation, that excuse isn't available to the non-believer. And you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. You know, we wouldn't punish a people unless we have sent them a messenger. And so with the warning having been given through divine revelation, those who did injustice could be fairly held morally accountable, while God does not compromise on his attribute of justice. And that brings the second argument to a close. And let me just conclude with some final remarks. First, for an in-depth treatment of the subject, please read my article. You could just type in Bassam Zawadi Deism in Google, and you'll probably find a link to my article. Of course, as I said, I mean, this presentation is a very simplified and top-level overview of some of the more essential points mentioned in the article. I was only able to cover 2 out of the 3 arguments against deism due to time constraints. So the article is very valuable, especially because it dives into addressing potential rebuttals and counter rebuttals to the arguments that I just presented to you. So if you're going to be having a discussion on the subject with someone who's well-informed, then it's essential that you do give the article a read and fully digest the material so that you be better prepared. Secondly, treat matters on a case-by-case basis. As I said, deists hold different opinions regarding certain theological stances. Make sure to seek clarity from the deist about what he or she believes, before making any assumptions of your own. And look, this presentation and my article take a very intellectual approach to the subject. They are meant to provide you with the intellectual arsenal required to deconstruct deism. However, in da'wah, please remember that things are more complicated than what meets the eye. A lot of people who are deists might outwardly pretend like they have intellectual doubts, but in reality, the source of their doubts might be more emotional. For example, someone might be fed up with Islam or with organized religion, in general, because of very poor experiences with religious people, for example, or perhaps because that person feels that deism offers him or her to live, offer a path to live their lives freely without having to abide by any religious rules. It could be for a number of reasons. So just remember that critical point. I mean, if anything my experience has taught me, it's that emotional baggage tends to be the main reason that people struggle with religion. And and finally, guidance is a very important reminder. Guidance is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It goes without saying that hidayah only comes by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These intellectual arguments that we're sharing and discussing are nothing but a means through which we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows guidance upon those and strengthens the iman of those whose difficulties and struggles with religion are truly and genuinely and sincerely intellectual in nature. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Barakallahu feekum for listening, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions at this point. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Okay, Brother Bassam, if you look at the bottom, there should be a Q&A tab. If you click on that, yeah, you'll see the questions there.
Sure. Okay, aren't you conflating wisdom with intelligence? Isn't it possible to be intelligent without being wise? Can you please explain in more detail how intelligence equates to wisdom? Classically, several ulama, and not just Islamic scholars, I would say a lot of people would define wisdom as properly utilizing your knowledge to actuate and enact things and to put them in their proper place. And that wisdom also entails acting in a meaningful manner and in a purposeful manner. And so intelligence would certainly be part or knowledge. It would certainly be a part of wisdom, and that's why some of the ulama, would say that it's that aspect of Allah's knowledge, that wisdom is an aspect of Allah's knowledge that effectuates His will, so that it materializes into things that would fulfill His objectives and His goals. So the idea that's being argued here is that for deists to believe in a God who is so wise enough to design the universe by knowing where everything fits, he's not just merely smart and knowledgeable, but is able to enact and act in a manner based on that knowledge to fulfill a certain purpose, which is the intricately designed and sustainable universe. Then how do you align that with him simultaneously doing so with such a meaningless purpose, with no purpose at all, in fact? And trust me, there's a lot of potential holes you could try to poke in the argument. That's why I strongly recommend that you do read the article, because I do deal with and interact with several possible rebuttals and counter rebuttals. So please do check it out. Why aren't deists destroyed by your arguments yet, still persisting in their ways? I did publish my article. I don't know how an argument can destroy a person. Alhamdulillah, Muslims have been refuting the kuffar for a long time right now with very strong arguments that they still exist and they're still around propagating their kufr. That's not a testament to the weakness in our arguments necessarily. I did publish my article just around a year ago, and it's on my academia page. I do hope to keep promoting it and building more awareness surrounding it, and and helping Muslims become more aware of deism, so that inshallah we could refute deists better. I don't know about destroying them, but yeah. Okay. Reason given the ability to acquire knowledge and recognize truth has been assigned to us. How can we reconcile being a Muslim with reason and not be a theist? So reason or aql is a God-given ability to acquire knowledge and recognize truth. It has been assigned an exalted status in Islam. How can we reconcile being a Muslim who reasons and not being a deist? Very simple, because deists are not using their reason properly. They're not using their rational faculties properly, because a part, just as Ibn Taymiyyah and others have argued, being reasonable entails you knowing the limits of your reason. It is unreasonable for you to think that you can know everything through your reason, especially matters of the unseen. To think that you could strictly and sheerly deduce, all the moral particulars, not moral universals, moral particulars, and to know the matters of the unseen and exactly what God is expecting of you strictly through your rationality, that's not being reasonable. So yes, and as you could see, brother, who's asking the question, my presentation has taken a very rational approach. So I am using my reason in my presentation to refute deism. So I hope I practically demonstrated how we could be reasonable and yet not be deists, because I tried to use reason to refute deism. Wouldn't it be presumptuous to assume that God is only concerned with the conduct of humans and make sure there are actions? Why can't this argument apply to divine revelation necessarily being sent to animals, as animals have a basic intuition of fairness, justice, etc.? I'm not sure we can make that leap necessarily. First of all, I wouldn't say that God is only concerned with humans. He's also concerned with jinn. So there is another realm out there that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be testing and judging. Animals don't have rational faculties. It doesn't make any sense to me, or I wouldn't expect why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send divine revelation to animals. Now, that's not to say that God is unconcerned with animals. Obviously, Islam has given us several dictates on how we should deal with animals. It takes a very strong stance against animal abuse, promotes animal rights, etc. So I wouldn't say that just because God doesn't send divine revelation to animals, that this would entail that God is unconcerned with animals. I don't think that's the case. I think those are all the arguments I could see in the Q&A. Yeah. So barakallahu feekum, and thank you once again for listening, and jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum.